Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman. I am the coordinator of CIGI's Global Policy Forum here in Ottawa. First, I would like to recognize the presence of members of the Diplomatic Corps. First, the High Commissioner of Barbados, Her Excellency Yvonne Waux, the Ambassador of Algeria, His Excellency Hossein Megar, the Ambassador of Portugal, His Excellency José Moreira de Cunha, and Senior Representative of Haiti in Beijing, formerly the head of the Haitian embassy here, Nathalie Guizelmenos, who's visiting from Beijing. And I'd also like to welcome members of the embassies of Sri Lanka, Slovak Republic, Romania, and I'm also pleased to welcome some former Canadian ambassadors who are with us. First, the former ambassador to China, Howard Balloch, who's visiting in Ottawa. We're lucky to have him here this evening. Former Canadian ambassador to Russia and Ukraine, Chris Westall. Former Canadian ambassador to the OAS in Chile, Paul Durand. Former Canadian ambassador to Kazakhstan and all those Central Asian countries, I'm always reminded, Margaret Skok. Former Canadian ambassador to Switzerland, John Noble. A former Canadian Consul General, if he's here, John Higginbotham, and Craig MacDonald, our former ambassador to Finland. I'm also pleased to welcome members of the Senate. We have two senators here this evening, the Parliament of Canada, the Canadian government, including Global Affairs, Bank of Canada, and National Defence. Also faculty and students of the University of Ottawa and Carleton University and members of the Ottawa business community. It's now my pleasure to ask CIGI's Director of Global Economy, Domenico Lombardi, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Domenico.
Thank you, Larry, and good afternoon to everybody. So I'm delighted to introduce Nick Lardy, the Anthony Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Nick is one of the world's most recognized experts on China. And I also wish to acknowledge that the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the think tank Nick is affiliated to, is a very close partner of ours at CIGI, and we are delighted to cooperate and to work with them. And I think Nick's presence today in Ottawa further attests to that. So Nick is going to elaborate on a topic that is pretty timely, China's transition to a new model of economic growth. And when we talk about the Chinese economy more in general, I think three things come to mind, at least to me. So the first is a transition from an investment-based economy to a more consumption-driven economy. And then there is a transition from an investment-driven economy to a manufacturing-based economy to a more service-oriented economy. And of course, the relationship between these two types of transition. And then we have an international dimension of this transition. So as, of course, China transitions towards a more service-based economy, we see that, for instance, in Asia, in a number of neighboring economies in Asia, we have seen drops in export flows to China. It's true that world export flows, world trade flows are slowing down, but nonetheless, the export drop that we are observing in some of the neighboring economies to China are particularly relevant. And then the third item is the international role of China and how this transition sort of interacts with this international role. Of course, this is particularly relevant this year. China chairs the G20, and therefore, the question is to what extent the transition that China is experiencing, and therefore the emphasis on new economic policies may affect some of the G20 conversation also happening at the same time. Clearly, these are broader issues. Nick is only going to have about 30 minutes to elaborate. I know he's going to focus on a number of those issues, not all. So the plan for today, Nick, is that you will, after you speak for about 30-35 minutes, We're going to have a Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we wrap up at about 6:30, and then we're going to have a reception as usual at this event series. So without any further ado, Nick, the floor to you. And thanks again for being in Ottawa with us today.
Thank you very much, Domenico, and I'm delighted to be here. I think China is always an interesting topic, but maybe it's a little bit hotter than usual these days. Certainly when you read the press and the financial press in particular, you get a range of views expressed. There are the super bears who think that China's growth has already slowed down to 2 or 3%, and then you get others that are more accepting of some of the official data that suggests the economy is still growing at a fairly robust pace. So what I want to do is take you through the transition that is underway, has gotten underway very slowly, this transition towards more consumption, more services, less investment, and less industrial output, with an important dimension of this also being different interactions with the global economy. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions. If you have a burning question along the way, I don't mind taking them as we go along if you'd like to do that. There is a handout. You know, economics is the dismal science, and I am going to refer to some of these diagrams, but they're very simple. I don't usually have more than 2 variables on a slide, so there are not a lot of moving parts to this, and it's pretty straightforward. But I'm going to. I think I need to retrieve my copy. That's fine. Well, we know there's been a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy. The days of the double-digit growth are behind us, and the first slide really points that out. We've been slowing down in terms of aggregate output since 2007. There was a little pickup in 2009, and then a continuous slowdown from 2010 onward. My view is that a very large portion of this slowdown is related to an adjustment in the property sector. China, many years ago, began investing very, very heavily in property. It became the big driver of economic growth, and it absorbed huge amounts of building materials, steel and cement, and so forth. And this is what drove the industrial sector. And as a result of this process, China had a bigger industrial sector as a share of total output than any other economy in the world. It was up around 40 or even more than 40%. But the growth of property has slowed down. It was growing well over 30% in 2010, and it has slowed down gradually until it hit 1% last year. The property investment, which is a combination of investment in housing and office buildings and commercial space, only grew 1% last year. You can see that in the second diagram, which I think is on page 3, from the 2010 peak, this big slowdown. In turn, that has driven down the growth of many major industrial products, such as steel, cement, and coal. At the peak, the property sector was absorbed. Remember, China produces over half of global steel, and about a quarter of that steel was going into property. When you think of property in China, it's not like North America where you think of 2x4s. They don't have any wood. They use cement and steel for virtually everything. And so there's a huge amount of steel going into property, not just high-rise buildings, but even medium-rise buildings. So as the property demand slowed down, the demand for steel slowed down. And then you can see in the next diagram, industrial growth slowed down. It was growing at 16% back in 2010. By the closing quarter of last year, the growth was under 6%, about 5.9%. So that has brought GDP growth down. Now, industrial growth gets an enormous amount of attention. And one of the reasons is the Chinese publish high-frequency data. We get monthly data on industrial value added, as it's referred to, plus a whole range of physical output data for a fairly broad range of products. The service sector, on the other hand, lurks there in the background. You don't read very much about it, in part because the data on the service sector only come out quarterly. They're not very disaggregated, and you don't get a lot of the output data, the real output data that goes along with it. But if you look on the sixth slide, you will see that the service sector didn't slow down so much. It started around 10% at the beginning of this period that we're looking at, and last year it slowed down to about 8.3%. And as a result, you can see that at least for the last 3 or 4 years, the service sector has been growing more rapidly than the industrial sector. So this is part of the transition that you heard about at the beginning, of this transition to a more service-dominated economy. And I guess the next diagram that actually shows that the service sector is now a little bit more than half of GDP. If you look closely at that diagram, in the first decade of this century, service sector output did not expand as a share of GDP. It was almost flat. And since around 2010, it has picked up. Its growth is much more rapid relative to GDP, so its share of total output is going up. But I should quickly add, it's still relatively low for an economy at China's level of economic development. Based on comparative analysis with other economies, we would expect in a more normal circumstance that services might be 55, maybe even 60% of GDP. We don't expect them to be as high as the US or Canada, where we have much higher income levels, but China's below where you'd expect it to be based on its per capita income. So my view is this transition to more services is still in a fairly early stage, but it is underway. The next slide just shows us what's happening to private consumption expenditures, and again, you can see a fairly substantial change. In the first decade of the 2000s, when we had the investment-led growth and a lot of exports, the service sector wasn't doing very well, and private consumption as a share of GDP was going down year after year after year. So something around 47, 48% at the beginning of the decade, down to a low of about 34% in 2009 or 10. Since that time, it has begun to go up again. It hasn't gone up very much, but compared to the trajectory that it had been on, it is quite a bit higher. So we are getting more, not only more service sector growth, but we're getting more private consumption expenditure. And as I'm going to argue, I think that this is, these two developments are obviously closely interrelated, as Dominica said at the outset. One of the good things about this is that the job creation from the development of the service sector is much stronger than the job creation associated with the development of the manufacturing sector. And as you can see on the ninth slide, if you add 1% of GDP in the service sector, you create about 1 million new jobs in China. If you do it in the industrial sector, you only create about 500,000 new jobs. So the good news is that even though the economy, and this is in the next slide, even though the economy has slowed down quite a bit, that's the red line, you can see it slowing down since 2007 or since 2010, but the creation of new jobs has held up reasonably well. Growth has come down about 40%, from roughly 10 point something to 6 point something, but the pace of job creation has only weakened about 20%. So job creation is holding up better than you would expect given the size of the slowdown in the headline growth number, and that simply reflects what I've already mentioned, and that is that the service sector is much more labor intensive than the industrial sector. Now the next slide is going to take me a little bit longer to get through, but I just wanted to give you these 5 bullet points to argue these are the things that are driving the transformation. I've just gone through the transformation very quickly. I haven't said a great deal about what the cause is, and what I want to do now is take you through some of the underlying economics. What's leading to more consumption? What's leading to more services? And the first factor that I want to mention is the demographics. Last year was the first year, we know China's aging, last year was the first year in which the working age population actually declined in absolute numbers. Now, why does this matter? It matters primarily because it means it is likely that wage growth will actually certainly stay strong as it has been and actually might accelerate. This is an economy where the wages have been going up by roughly 10% per year in real terms for more than a decade. So the wage share of GDP as opposed to the property income share of GDP, the wage share is going up. And given the demographic developments, I think that that is likely to continue. It is more or less baked in because of the age structure of the population and how it's changing. The second factor that's a driver is this idea that goes back, I think, to the 19th century. Mr. Engel had this idea that the share of expenditures that people devote to certain categories varies systematically as their incomes goes up. And one of the most obvious ones is that the share of income that people spend on food goes down. At roughly, if your income's, the most recent study I've seen, if your income's $2,000 a year, you spend about 50 to 60% of your income on food. If it's $200,000 a year, you spend about 2% of your income on food. So what do you spend more on as you get richer and richer? To a considerable extent, it goes to services. People spend more on education. They want better health care. They want to start to travel. Tourism picks up quite a bit. Things like entertainment. You can see in China the numbers for entertainment are extraordinary. In 2013, movie ticket sales measured by renminbi went up 30%. 2014, they went up 40%. 2015, they went up 50%. This is why this guy that owns Wanda, this famous Chinese company, bought out AmC, the big US movie chain, a few years ago, and he's got another big transaction in the works. So people are spending a lot more on entertainment, whether it's movies or sporting events or cultural events of one thing or another. Now that, again, drives the demand for services. So services demand is going up because people's incomes are going up, so they're going to consume more, and a larger share of what they're consuming is going to be in the service sector, demand for services rather than goods. The third thing that I highlight here is that China has been remarkably successful, I would judge, in building out the social safety net. Not too many years ago, most of the population had no health insurance, no pensions, and very little to fall back on except their immediate family members to support them in old age or to take care of them if they had to go into the hospital for whatever reason. So here's an economy today with a per capita income, depending on how you measure it and so forth, it's really only about $7,000. 95% of the population has some form of health insurance. Now, it's not gold-plated, it doesn't cover going to the doctor for your annual checkup, but if you go into the hospital and have some significant medical issue that's costly, you will be reimbursed for a very substantial portion of the cost. Maybe not 100%, but it might be 70, 60, 80%, depending on where you live. Similarly, more and more people have some access to pensions, and I believe that this is a very important factor that has tended to bring down the savings rate. China has had, in the household sector, one of the highest saving rates of any economy ever on record in any time in recorded history. It peaked out in 2010 at 40%. Can you imagine people are saving 40% of their after-tax income? Remember, in the US during the financial crisis, there were a few quarters where the savings rate went negative and then got up to 1 or 2%. I think now it's up to around 5%, maybe 6%. But that's kind of typical for very high income countries. You'd have a savings rate in something in the mid-single digits. Maybe Canada does better, I don't know. But 40% is off the scale. It has begun to come down. It's now down to the high 30s, something around 30s. Since 2010, it's been coming down gradually. And this reinforces the tendency for more consumption. In other words, more consumption is a function basically of two things, higher incomes and lower savings. And China has both. Incomes are going up because of rising wages, and the savings rate is coming down. So that's another factor that underlies the transition to a more service-driven economy, more consumption-driven economy. Another factor, and this gets into the exchange rate, which I know can quickly be quite boring, but in the first decade of this century, China had an undervalued exchange rate. Remember, they got an undervalued exchange rate because the central bank was in there buying up foreign exchange. I always kind of try to reverse that, and I think it's better to think of it as they're selling domestic currency. they're buying foreign currency, and by selling all this domestic currency into the market, they drive its value down relative to where it would be if there wasn't this kind of intervention by the central bank. So they had a very undervalued currency, which is basically a subsidy to exports. And 95% of what China exports is industrial goods, manufacturers of one sort or another. So manufacturing was getting a big subsidy, and this, remember, was the period in which China's exports were growing extremely rapidly after they joined the WTO. But the flip side of that is that the undervalued exchange rate was also an implicit tax on goods that are not traded, and most of what's not traded is services. Services are typically thought of as non-traded goods. People don't fly to Beijing to get their hair cut or have an operation or something like that. So the undervalued currency encouraged investment in the industrial sector and was part of the whole program of industrial sector investment-driven growth. That began to change slowly starting in 2005, and by today the currency's appreciated about 55% in real terms compared to the middle of 2005, and the subsidy to manufacturing has by and large disappeared. I agree with the International Monetary Fund, in which they said they made their definitive assessment last year saying that the RMB should no longer be regarded as an undervalued currency. What has happened? We can see the confirmation of what's happened in that. Remember, I said in the decade of the 2000s, the share of investment going into manufacturing and the industrial sector more broadly was going up and the service sector was going down. Now, in the last 3 years, the share of China's overall investment that's going into services has started to go up. Last year was close to 60%. In other words, entrepreneurs, most of the Chinese economy is private with the exception of some sectors where the state has preserved its own sphere of influence, so to speak. Most of the investment is private, and increasingly private businesses see there are more opportunities arising in the service sector than in the manufacturing sector, so we're seeing a shift of investment into manufacturing. I've already mentioned the other factor, the relative labor intensity of services production. This increases the demand for labor in a kind of as a feedback effect into the labor market that causes wages to go up, and you kind of repeat the cycle. Now, the main point I want to stress is that I use the word structural because I think most of these drivers of service sector growth will continue to be quite important in the coming years. The demographics are built in, the Engel curve is built in. This is a phenomenon we see in all countries. There are no exceptions. I don't think the government's going to roll back the social safety net for obvious reasons. I don't think they're going back to have an undervalued currency. And labor intensity of service production is in the inherent nature of services as compared to manufacturing. Manufacturing, you have a lot of economies of scale and so forth. You don't have that so much in the service sector. So I think the relative rapid growth of the service sector is likely to continue. And that's one of the reasons I don't think China is going to have a hard landing. Remember, I mentioned earlier, services are a bit over 50% of GDP. According to official data, they grew at a little over 8% last year. So the service sector alone is contributing at least 4 percentage points to China's GDP growth. And the industrial sector is growing much more slowly, but it's still growing a little bit. So when you start looking at the economy from this perspective, a growth rate in the 6% range, maybe not absolutely as high as 6.9, but something in the 6% range seems like a reasonable estimate of what was happening in the Chinese economy last year. The other narrative that they're into the hard landing, that they're growing at 2 or 3% or soon will be, doesn't seem to be supported by the kinds of evidence that we can look at and analyze. So I'm against the hard landing hypothesis. I'm against the super bears who think and talk in doom and gloom terms. Now, in the last part of my remarks, I want to turn to what about the longer run? How is China going to do over a 5 or a 10-year period? Yes, services are going to help them out here. And I want to give you two different approaches as to what the growth path might be. And the bottom line of both of them is very simple. If China undertakes the additional reforms that I think it needs, and which it had agreed to that in the document that the party put out in the fall of 2013, the so-called third plenum document, which outlined a very comprehensive set of reforms, I think they have a very good understanding of what they need to do. So the first idea that I want to talk about is what some people call convergence. And the idea is very simple. When you're far from the frontier is typically the United States in recent history. If you're a country with a per capita income that's far below the United States, you have the potential to borrow technology, to absorb technology from the West more generally, and grow fast and catch up. And what this diagram does is for 4 other countries in East Asia, shows you that catch-up factor. The diagram's a little complicated, but let's just take Japan, for example. The yellow squares tell you where the country was when it started its rapid growth and its catch-up. And all these countries were roughly at about you read it on the right-hand side. I didn't have my glasses on for a minute. They're all roughly at about 20 to 25% of the US level. And then you can see they grew quite rapidly in Japan. It started in the early 50s. In South Korea, it started in the mid-70s. Taiwan also in the mid-70s. I'll skip Singapore. And they all grew very fast, and the number at the top of the bar tells you how fast they grew in that 20-year period, and basically you can see they grew at about 8 or maybe as much as 9% per year. Now the little triangle at the top tells you where they were relative to the US when their growth started to slow down. And for most of these countries, we're looking at roughly 55–60% of the US level. That's when their growth tapered off and they began to grow more slowly. Obviously, a number of factors. You can point to the Japanese and the Louvre Accord and all kinds of other details of the 70 and the oil, the big oil price spike in 74, and Japan slowed down. But the point here is that China today, by this measure of per capita income, which is, I think, in the footnotes, measured in purchasing power parity terms, which we don't need to go into, China today is at 25% of the US level. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means a couple of things. First of all, it means that China started its rapid growth in the late 70s from an extraordinarily low level. China's economy today is at least 25 times bigger than it was in 1978. Population has grown some, obviously over a period of 35 years or so, but the economy is much, much bigger, and it has grown very, very rapidly, something close to 10% already for 35 years. So if you think that the catch-up is in 30 years and you're done, then China's done. But China started at such a low base that it's only now today, in relative terms, where Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were when their rapid economic growth began. So the basic takeaway is that China still has significant convergence potential, significant catch-up potential. It doesn't mean that it's automatic. You have to adopt the kind of policies that allow you to capture that potential. So this is pointing to potential, is not a forecast for what they will do. It's a forecast for what they might do if they engaged in a more significant economic reform over the next few years. Larry Summers has a different idea. He's writing about it all the time. He thinks China's going to converge to 3%. He says, they've already been growing for 30 years. Nobody's kept, they've been growing faster for longer than any other country in recorded history. And he says, well, nobody grows this fast for 30 years, beyond 30 years, so they will grow down to 3%. Well, maybe they will go down to 3%, but I don't think it's inevitable, and I think if they undertake the right kind of economic reforms, they still have a significant potential for catch-up, or what is sometimes called convergence. Now, the other aspect that comes, quite frankly, to a very similar conclusion is to look at the state sector in China and to try to recognize what a very substantial drag on China's economic growth that the state sector represents. I wrote a book in 2014 that's called Markets Over Mao, in which I documented the critical importance of the private sector in explaining China's economic growth since 1978. The private sector accounts for all of the job creation that occurred in China since 1978, which is a lot, in the hundreds of millions. Most of the growth of output, most of the growth of exports, and I could go on. But the state sector, as you can see from diagram 13, still controls a lot of assets. This is partly a legacy issue. They had a lot of investment over the years. They control a lot of assets. It's a little over 100 trillion RMB in 2013, 100 trillion RMB in 2013 is roughly twice China's GDP. So they don't contribute so much to economic growth anymore, but they have a lot of assets. Now, the next diagram shows you what they do with those assets. And as you can see, the Zhurongji reforms, which you may not remember, but were in the late 90s, in which they downsized a lot of state-owned enterprises, and some of them went bankrupt, some of them were privatized. They got rid of the worst performing ones, and you can see that from 98 on, the return on assets of these state companies improved quite dramatically. I mean, it was pathetically low. It's measured on the right-hand side. It was pathetically low in 98, around 1%. Then it went up to about 7%. But you can see now the trend is down. It's back down to 3%. And the impetus of the Zhurongji reforms, I would say, have been lost. They got rid of the worst performers, but they couldn't keep up the momentum. They went into the WTO. That created a lot of new competition and new incentives. But the effect of that seems to have waned in more recent years, and the productivity of state companies is very low. And just to make it very stark, look at the second to the last diagram, where you compare the performance of these state companies with private companies. You can see private companies have continued to go up all the way through 2011. They've come down a little bit as China's growth has slowed down. But since roughly 2010, the performance of private companies is 3 times better than state companies. So either you increase competition and get the state companies to perform better. If they can't perform better, they should be required to sell assets, maybe even be taken over by private companies, so you get the assets into the hands of companies that can make better use of the assets. If China was able to do that, this would add enormously to economic growth, because remember, it's over 100 trillion in assets on a 50 trillion GDP in 2013. If you could raise that up to 4%, it would be a big, big increment to growth. So my view is that they need to open up some of these sectors that have been closed to private firms, sectors like upstream oil and gas, telecommunications, finance, banking, insurance, securities, and so forth, where state firms are still completely dominant. So my conclusion is, yes, China's growth is slowing, partly for a good reason, to slow down property investment, which I think had some risks associated with it. But the super bears that are saying 3 or 4%, I don't think is remotely plausible. I think the transition to growth driven by consumption and services is underway. It's still modest, but I think it will continue because it's largely driven by structural factors of the type that I've talked about. And I think if they reform appropriately, China has a future of a significant period of growth in the 7% range, rather than slowing down to the medium single digits. Thank you. So I hope
Mr. Lardy is open to questions. If you have a question, would you come to either of these 2 microphones and identify yourself? Who is the first person? Senator.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating and different from what one reads in the newspapers. 2 somewhat related questions. The financial sector is considered to be having severe difficulties, and that is not unrelated to the problems with the SOEs. A large proportion of loans that are not being serviced properly. What impact does that have on the kind of scenario you paint? Second one is a little bit more of a speculative question. Do you think that the increase in authoritarianism in China has something to do with the changes that the government is planning to do? Thank you.
I didn't catch one word in the second question. The increase in what? Authoritarianism, okay. Well, the financial sector is the weak underbelly of this economy, and it is primarily, as I indicated, state-owned companies are borrowing too much, and their return on assets is very low, and appears that a significant chunk of the money they borrow is not invested. They're using it to pay operating expenses. In other words, their efficiency is so low they can't cover their wages and their electric bill and their suppliers from the income of the sale of their products, so they just keep borrowing more money. This is obviously not sustainable in the long run, and ultimately will require some remediation, substantial write-off of loans from the banking system, maybe even some recapitalization. It's very difficult. The size of the problem is difficult to measure, I think, even if you're on the inside, and I think from the outside it's nearly impossible. There is one thing we can say with confidence, and that is the longer they wait to address this problem, the worse it gets. And that is one of the reasons I'm encouraged by the announcement in recent weeks that they're going to lay off 1.8 million people in the steel and coal sectors, which are the biggest money-losing sectors right now. And they're going to devote 100 billion RMB to try to retrain these people, give them better unemployment insurance, or get them onto their pensions a few years earlier than they would otherwise be eligible. And this is a very important step to stop the bleeding. People say, well, how can they do that? Won't there be social instability, unrest, workers in the streets? Well, there could be some of that. 1.8 million always sounds like a lot, but everything in China is a lot. The modern sector workforce, the urban workforce, is in excess of 400 million. So laying off 1.8 million, not everybody is going to be on the streets. It's going to be, there may be a lot of people on the streets proportionally in a few cities that are very heavily coal or steel oriented. So I think that's a positive sign. Now, your second question was on authoritarianism. Okay. I don't know. I'm not a political scientist, so you shouldn't listen to what I say. But Xi Jinping obviously feels, he has dramatically increased the role of the party, the restrictions on intellectuals, the crackdown on NGOs and human rights lawyers, and so forth and so on. So I think politically, China is going through a very difficult period. Now, the optimists say, well, he wants to be in firm control before he undertakes these reforms that might be somewhat destabilizing. I don't know. It might be the case that he just wants more control no matter what. I can't tell.
My name is Victor Rabinovich. I'm really struck, of course, by the extraordinary savings rates, household saving rates that you were referring to. And sure, there's somewhat of a decline. Nevertheless, it's still a vast amount of money that has to be invested somewhere. And that somewhere, I think, in the past had gone into at least some of the property development and some of the investments made by whether banking companies or by shadow banking companies into property development. With the slowdown in property development now, what is the impact overall on the health of the banking sector, and what is the impact, at least on the psychology of people who are saving and hoping to get some return on their savings?
This is a very interesting question, and the answer is maybe a little bit complicated, but I'll try to keep it brief. China in the decade of the 2000s was what I think most economists would call a highly repressed financial system. And the main characteristic of that system was that savers earned nothing on their savings. In the decade of the 2000s, the average return to bank savings deposits declined by 300 basis points compared to the previous period, and the average return was negative. And so My view is that one of the reasons people started piling into property in the 2000s was that property prices kept going up and up and up. And so people, if you're saving 40% of your income and you can put it in the bank and it's slowly evaporating, or you can buy, and a lot of people were buying a second house because prices were going up year after year in many cities at double-digit rates. So it seemed like a very good investment. So a lot of money went into property, and that's one of the financial repression is one of the ways they got onto this overinvestment in property. Now, the good news is that the degree of financial repression has very substantially eased. They've liberalized interest rates. Inflation has come down, and that combination means that bank savings deposits now are earning a positive return. And there has been liberalization of the financial sector. Alibaba, this very well-known firm, has started a money market fund that for a while was paying about 200 basis points more than bank deposits. I thought, sure, the government was going to shut it down, but they didn't. They let it keep going, and the rates, the 2 percentage point differential got eroded a little bit. And then you had the rise of wealth management products, which was another savings vehicle that offered higher returns than bank deposits. So this kind of implicit tax on the household sector has substantially eased. And I think that's one of the reasons why investment in property is moderating. People are seeing, well, we've been through 2 or 3 years of declining property prices. Real interest rates are a little bit higher for savers. So people are, at the margin, reallocating more of their savings into financial assets rather than into real property. Now, what's the effect of this in the health of the banking system? The banks in China are still pretty profitable as measured by return on assets, and they certainly did that in part in the previous decade because they didn't have to pay much for the deposits because the deposit rate had a ceiling. So the banks were generating fairly high returns. It is said that this will begin to come down as they have to pay higher rates on deposits because of liberalization of deposit rates, but it hasn't really happened yet. So the main concern about the banking sector is the degree of non-performing loans. And the good news is that the share of money that these banks lend to state-owned companies, the absolute amount, of course, has gone up a lot, but the share of money that they lend to these companies has been cut in half compared to the 90s when we had the last big bank recapitalization. And that's in part because of the rise of private enterprises that are getting a very large share of bank lending now in the corporate lending sphere, and the rise of household lending. In the 90s, banks didn't lend any money to households, but the property market began in the late 90s, and now in most periods about 40% of all the loans are going to households rather than to businesses. And they still have very strong standards for getting a mortgage. You have to come up with a down payment. It's kind of like the United States in the 50s and 60s. You had to come up with 20 or 30% down payment, and you had to keep paying the mortgage. There is no refi in China. You can't check the paper the next morning and say, oh, I'm going to refinance my house and take out a couple $100,000 and go to Barbados on vacation for a few weeks. And you can't get a home equity loan. So you start with a big down payment and you keep paying it down. So the average loan to value ratio in the Chinese housing market is very low. So I don't think there's much of a risk of default. So the biggest problem still is with the loans to state companies, and this is a relatively small portion of total bank lending. So the recapitalization challenge I don't think would be on the same scale in relative terms as it was in the very early 2000s when they recapitalized the major state-owned banks.
David Dodge, I think this is an excellent presentation and reasonably balanced, not going all the way to where Larry is, but perhaps a little bit too optimistic. And the reason that, or what I would like you to explain, is in chart 9, you've given what I think is very sensible. You've said that services can absorb a lot more people than industry did, and so the transition, as we lay off all these people in the north, that services can pick up the employment. The trouble on the service side, though, historically, as we've seen around the world, is the productivity has generally been lower than the productivity in that very industry sector that they're replacing. And so the rate of growth of productivity in China, which has been enormous, partly because of the move off the land, but also because the industrial productivity has risen dramatically over time, it's hard to see that that productivity growth can continue in the same way as they move into the service sector. At least it's hard for me to consider it. Obviously, if you're going to stay at 7, you believe that that can be so. And so I'd just like you to explain why you think they can get that productivity growth in the service sector to keep that income growing in the way it has been.
Well, you're absolutely right. It is frequently the case that services pay somewhat lower wages than manufacturing, and the productivity growth is a little bit less over time. The reason I'm still a little bit optimistic is that at the moment there are a large number of people employed in the industrial sector that are not producing anything. So if they shift into the service sector, maybe their productivity will be low, but it will be higher than where they were. Let me give you a specific example. In the steel sector, it is said that they have, we don't want to get into the details, but several 100 million tons of excess steel capacity that they want to get rid of. Well, my reaction to that is, well, what are they going to do? Break up the furnaces and sell it for scrap? They won't earn very much that way. But the problem is, these steel companies still have the workforce on hand that could produce those extra couple 100 million tons. So these people are getting paid, maybe not from the revenues of the company, but from borrowing from the banks and other sources of finance. So really their value added is negligible, perhaps even zero. So if you move them into a service sector job, it might not have the same productivity as the workers that are still gainfully employed in the steel sector, but it'll be a lot higher than what they were doing. So I think there's still a potential for raising growth. This is a problem that's characteristic of the state sector. When demand for their product slows down, in the old days they used to keep producing and it went into inventory. Now they don't do that anymore, but they keep the workers on the payroll. They still get the benefits. They may get a slight reduction in their pay. Some of them, they don't have to come to work. They have this classification called off-post. Off-post means you're kind of semi-laid off, but you haven't really been separated from your firm. You still get some of the benefits, and you still get a big chunk of your salary. But they're not doing anything. They're not adding to value. They're not producing anything. So moving these people into other kinds of job would definitely be an improvement.
What a shy audience is here.
Ian Shugart. The other area, of course, in the service sector that has potential for productivity growth is in public services like healthcare and education and so on. Do you see the overall financial policies of the government supporting the rapid growth of those sectors as the middle class and this consumer-led growth occurs? And I also had a question about what we might call the more purely innovative side of the economy. What are the prospects for China as it has become more globally engaged and the high education sector has grown? What prospects do you see for the more purely innovative side of the economy to contribute to growth?
Well, the second part of the question is a very tough one, but I'll take a crack at it. But let me take the first one on education and health. Government expenditures in these areas has been rising in absolute terms, of course, a little bit in terms of percentage of GDP. So there has been, they have made very major strides in increasing enrollment in secondary schools, secondary school graduation rates. They've dramatically expanded tertiary education in recent years. So some more resources are going into that. The healthcare sector is more difficult to judge. It's a mess. for a number of reasons. They rely too much on drug sales and so forth. But the good news is that they are allowing now the private sector to begin to have a role. Again, according to the Chinese data, if you look at investment in education, a few years ago, private investment was negligible. Now it's up to 15% of total investment. So you see the rise of private schools. Some of them are highly specialized, Wall Street English or whatever it's called, where they have hundreds of outlets where they're teaching people English that want to learn English. Or their preschool, or their private kindergartens. There are even a few private universities. And in the healthcare, the same trend is underway. There are now a significant, I think there's something like 2,000 hospitals that have private funding now in China. Now, that's not a very big number in the Chinese scheme of things, but a few years ago it would have been much less. So I think it's a twofold response. There's a bit more public money going into those things, but there's a bit more private money. And a lot of the private money, of course, is driven by this demand that I was talking about earlier. People want a higher standard of health care than they can get going to the municipal hospital. And so entrepreneurial individuals and foreign companies as well are moving in to the healthcare space, and that has been somewhat liberalized. So the demand is there, and the supply response is coming at least increasingly from the private sector, including foreign firms. Now the innovative, how are they doing in the innovative area? Well, in some ways it appears that China's doing very well. I mean, they have more online finance than we do. A higher share of their retail sales is through e-tail than it is in the United States. You look at the number of people that are paying online, all these payment services, the rise of P2P lending and crowdfunding. It's taking off in China. So at least in the financial, and Alibaba is playing a big role. They've now started their own bank called My Bank. Tencent, their competitor, has a bank called WeBank. These are two genuinely private banks that were licensed by the government a couple of years ago, and they're engaged in increasing lending volume of lending activity and providing some competition to the traditional state banks. So certainly in the internet space, I think there's a lot of innovation going on in China, and as reflected in some of the indicators that I mentioned.
Fine, thank you. Then I would like to ask Hongying Wong to come and thank our speaker.
Okay, so I just wanted to, on behalf of CIGI, thank Dr. Lardy for coming here to share his insights with us, and I'm going to take advantage of my 2 minutes and make a couple of comments on what Dr. Lardy had to say. I'm glad the last question was about innovation, because I think in January, Xi Jinping reiterated the position of the Chinese government that under the new normal of slower economic growth, there are really three new drivers the government sees as potentially keeping the Chinese economy going, and these are services, household consumption, and innovation. So we've heard from Dr. Lardy a lot about the transition to the services at the expense of manufacturing, and we also heard the transition at a slower pace to a domestic private consumption-based growth model. But I'm just really intrigued by the juxtaposition of these two charts. You can see one of them has been far more successful so far. The second transition has been at a slower pace. So my own, I guess, speculation is that the transition to services is less politically contentious than the transition to a more domestic consumption-based model of growth. It's just, I think, very interesting to see the political factors at work in these tale of two transitions, so to speak. So the third issue about innovation, I'm a little bit less optimistic than Dr. Lardy because of what one of the questions mentioned before of the authoritarian nature, which has really in recent weeks and months become so much more severe than in recent years. So in a climate like this, there are certainly severe constraints to many kinds of innovation. So the second very quick comment I wanted to make is it is interesting to consider the implications for the rest of the world in light of China's transition to a new model of economic growth. So certainly the domestic consumption, the rising importance of domestic consumption, even though at a slower pace, is going to have worldwide implications. On the one hand, I mean, the good news is, well, the trade surplus of China probably will go down over time. On the other hand, if you're a commodities-dependent country, of which Canada is one, then the reduction of manufacturing, the rise of services may not necessarily be good news. So something to think about. And lastly, as China at least tries to become more innovative, we might see in the next few years a even more obvious turn away from foreign investment coming out of China into resource-rich countries, but maybe a rise into of that kind of investment in countries where high-end manufacturing and tech sectors are particularly developed. So anyway, I just thought I'd share a few thoughts, and I want to thank you again, Dr. Lardy, for a very informative and enlightening presentation. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larry Lederman. I am the coordinator of CIGI's Global Policy Forum here in Ottawa. First, I would like to recognize the presence of members of the Diplomatic Corps. First, the High Commissioner of Barbados, Her Excellency Yvonne Waux, the Ambassador of Algeria, His Excellency Hossein Megar, the Ambassador of Portugal, His Excellency José Moreira de Cunha, and Senior Representative of Haiti in Beijing, formerly the head of the Haitian embassy here, Nathalie Giselmenos, who's visiting from Beijing. And I'd also like to welcome members of the embassies of Sri Lanka, Slovak Republic, Romania, and I'm also pleased to welcome some former Canadian ambassadors who are with us. First, the former ambassador to China, Howard Ballock, who's visiting in Ottawa. We're lucky to have him here this evening.
Very close partner of ours at CIGI, and we are delighted to cooperate and to work with them. And I think Nick's presence today in Ottawa further attests to that. So Nick is going to elaborate on a topic that is pretty timely, China's transition to a new model of economic growth. And when we talk about the Chinese economy more in general, I think three things come to mind, at least to me. So the first is a transition from an investment-based economy to a more consumption-driven economy. And then there is a transition from an investment-driven economy to a manufacturing-based economy to a more service-oriented economy, and of course the relationship between these two types of transition. And then we have an international dimension of this transition. So as, of course, China transitions towards a more service-based economy, we see that, for instance, in Asia, in a number of neighboring economies in Asia, we have seen drops in export flows to China. It's true that world export flows, world trade flows are slowing down, but nonetheless, the export drop that we are observing in some of the neighboring economies to China are particularly relevant. And then the third item is the international role of China. and how this transition sort of interacts with this international role. Of course, this is particularly relevant this year. China chairs the G20, and therefore, the question is to what extent the transition that China is experiencing, and therefore the emphasis on new economic policies, may affect some of the G20 conversation also happening at the same time. Clearly, these are broader issues. Nick is only going to have about 30 minutes to elaborate. I know he's going to focus on a number of those issues, not all. So the plan for today, Nick, is that you will, after you speak for about 30-35 minutes, we're going to have a Q&A for about 15 minutes, and then we wrap up at about 6:30, and then we're going to have a reception as usual at this event series. So without any further ado, Nick, the floor to you. And thanks again for being in Ottawa with us today.
Thank you very much, Domenico, and I'm delighted to be here. I think China is always an interesting topic, but maybe it's a little bit hotter than usual these days. Certainly when you read the press, and the financial press in particular, you get a range of views expressed. There are the super bears who think that China's growth has already slowed down to 2 or 3%, and then you get others that are more accepting of some of the official data that suggests the economy is still growing at a fairly robust pace. So what I want to do is take you through the transition that is underway, has gotten underway very slowly, this transition towards more consumption, more services, less investment, and less industrial output, with an important dimension of this also being different interactions with the global economy. I'm going to try to leave plenty of time for questions. If you have a burning question along the way, I don't mind taking them as we go along if you'd like to do that. There is a handout. Economics is the dismal science, and I am going to refer to some of these diagrams, but they're very simple. I don't usually have more than 2 variables on a slide, so there are not a lot of moving parts to this, and it's pretty straightforward. But I'm going to. I think I need to retrieve my copy. That's fine. Well, we know there's been a significant slowdown in the Chinese economy. The days of the double-digit growth are behind us. In the first slide,
former Canadian ambassador to Russia and Ukraine, Chris Westall, former Canadian ambassador to the OAS in Chile, Paul Durand, former Canadian ambassador to Kazakhstan and all those Central Asian countries, I'm always reminded, Margaret Skok, former Canadian ambassador to Switzerland, John Noble, a former Canadian Consul General, if he's here, John Higginbotham, and Craig MacDonald, our former ambassador to Finland. I'm also pleased to welcome members of the Senate. We have 2 senators here this evening, the Parliament of Canada, the Canadian government, including Global Affairs, Bank of Canada, and National Defence. Also faculty and students of the University of Ottawa and Carleton University, and members of the Ottawa business community. It's now my pleasure to ask CIGI's Director of Global Economy, Domenico Lombardi, to introduce our distinguished speaker. Domenico.
Thank you, Larry, and good afternoon to everybody. So I'm delighted to introduce Nick Lardy, the Anthony Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Nick is one of the world's most recognized experts on China. And I also wish to acknowledge that the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the think tank Nick is affiliated to, is a